264 BC, the Strait of Messina, separating Sicily from the Italian mainland. Hanno the Great, commander of the Carthaginian fleet patrolling the narrow waters, watched from the deck of his quinquereme as Roman soldiers gathered on the Italian shore across the strait. The Romans had just committed to their first major war beyond the Italian peninsula, agreeing to defend the city of Messana from Syracusan attack. This commitment meant confronting Carthage, the dominant naval power in the western Mediterranean for over 5 centuries. Hanno knew what every Carthaginian admiral knew, what every Greek merchant captain knew, what every power that touched the Mediterranean understood as fundamental reality. Rome had no navy. The Romans were a land power. Their military reputation rested on their legions, the disciplined infantry formations that had conquered the Italian peninsula through 3 centuries of constant warfare. But the legions couldn't cross water. Rome possessed no warships, no experienced admirals, no trained naval crews, no shipyards capable of building war galleys, no maritime tradition stretching back generations. The few vessels Rome operated were merchant ships and coastal patrol craft, utterly inadequate for naval warfare against a power that had dominated Mediterranean sea lanes since before Rome was significant. Hanno's assessment, shared by every Carthaginian commander and political leader, was that Rome's intervention in Sicily would fail because they lacked the naval capacity to supply and reinforce their army across the strait. Carthage would blockade the Roman forces, cut their supply lines, and starve them into withdrawal. The war would be decided not by legions on land, but by Carthaginian quinqueremes controlling the sea. Rome's military prowess was irrelevant if they couldn't transport or supply their forces. The strategic calculation seemed obvious and unassailable. What Hanno couldn't imagine as he watched those Roman soldiers across the strait was that within 60 days, Rome would possess a fleet of over 100 fully operational warships. What no Carthaginian could foresee was that Rome would achieve this impossible feat by reverse engineering a single captured Carthaginian ship, training crews using a method so unconventional it seemed absurd, and inventing a tactical innovation that would transform naval warfare. The mathematics of naval construction were being written not in centuries of accumulated maritime tradition, but in the desperate improvisation of a land power that refused to accept that lack of experience meant accepting defeat. The story of how Rome built a navy from nothing begins with understanding just how completely Rome lacked naval capability in 264 BC. The Roman state possessed no institutional knowledge of naval warfare. No Roman citizen had commanded a war galley in battle. No Roman shipwright had built a quinquereme, the standard heavy warship that dominated Mediterranean naval combat. The Roman treasury had no budget for naval operations. Roman military doctrine contained no section on fleet tactics because no Roman commander had ever needed such knowledge. The contrast with Carthage was absolute. Carthage had been a maritime power since its founding by Phoenician colonists around 814 BC. For over 500 years, Carthaginian merchants and admirals had sailed the Mediterranean, establishing trade networks, founding colonies, fighting naval battles against Greeks and Syracusans and various rivals. Carthaginian shipyards in North Africa and on islands across the Mediterranean produced warships using techniques refined through generations. Carthaginian navigators knew every harbor, every current, every seasonal wind pattern across the western Mediterranean. The Carthaginian quinquereme represented the culmination of centuries of Mediterranean shipbuilding evolution. The vessel measured approximately 150 feet in length, with a beam of perhaps 25 feet. The name quinquereme derived from the rowing system. 5 rowers per vertical section, arranged in a configuration that historians still debate, but which probably involved 2 rowers on the upper oar, 2 on the middle oar, and 1 on the lower oar. This arrangement required approximately 300 rowers plus marines, sailors, and officers, bringing total crew to around 400 men per ship. The construction was sophisticated and specialized. The hull was built shell first, with planks edge-joined using mortise and tenon joints, creating a strong, flexible structure that could withstand ramming attacks and rough seas. The ram itself, a bronze-sheathed extension of the keel, was the ship's primary weapon. Naval tactics centered on ramming enemy vessels below the waterline, creating damage that would sink or disable the target. The skill required to position a quinquereme for a successful ram while avoiding being rammed in return required years of training and experience. Carthaginian crews were professional sailors and rowers, many serving for years in the fleet. The coordination required to row a quinquereme effectively, 300 men moving 150 oars in precise synchronization, demanded constant practice and experienced leadership. Carthaginian naval officers came from families with generations of maritime tradition. The knowledge of how to handle a warship in combat, how to read wind and current, how to execute tactical maneuvers, was accumulated expertise that seemed impossible to replicate quickly. When Rome declared war on Carthage in 264 BC over control of Sicily, the Senate understood immediately that naval power would be decisive. Sicily was an island. Any sustained military operation there required sea transport for troops, supplies, and reinforcements. Carthage's naval superiority meant they could blockade Roman forces, prevent resupply, and potentially raid the Italian coast with impunity. Roman military success on land would be meaningless if they couldn't maintain forces in the theater. The Roman Senate's response demonstrated the characteristic determination that would define Roman military history. They decided to build a fleet. The decision was extraordinary, not because building ships was impossible, but because building a fleet large enough and competent enough to challenge Carthage within any reasonable time frame seemed to defy everything about naval warfare. Maritime powers weren't created through political decisions. They evolved through centuries of accumulated tradition, knowledge, and infrastructure. The Romans began with nothing but a piece of extraordinary luck. A Carthaginian quinquereme, patrolling too close to the Italian coast, ran aground and was captured by Roman forces before the crew could destroy it. This captured vessel became the template for the entire Roman fleet. Roman shipwrights swarmed over the grounded quinquereme, measuring every dimension, studying every joint, analyzing every component. They created detailed plans based on this single example, plans that would be distributed to shipyards across Roman-controlled Italy. The decision to reverse engineer the Carthaginian ship was pragmatic desperation. Rome had no native tradition of building warships. They lacked the institutional knowledge that Carthaginian yards possessed. Attempting to design warships from first principles would take years and probably produce inferior vessels. By copying an existing design known to be effective, Rome could bypass generations of iterative development. The approach was entirely practical. If Carthaginian quinqueremes worked, build Roman versions of the same design. The Senate ordered the construction of 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes, lighter vessels with 3 banks of oars. The timeline was unprecedented, 60 days from start to launch. The order went to Roman allies across Italy who possessed timber, metalworking capability, and workers who could be mobilized for the project. The actual construction sites were scattered. Some ships built at Rome's river port at Ostia, others at coastal towns with suitable facilities, still others at allied cities with shipbuilding infrastructure. The reverse engineering process revealed both Roman determination and the sophisticated nature of Carthaginian shipbuilding. The mortise and tenon joinery that connected hull planks required precise woodworking. Each joint needed to be cut accurately and fitted tightly to create a hull strong enough to withstand combat stress and rough seas. Roman carpenters, experienced in land-based construction but unfamiliar with ship carpentry, learned techniques through examination of the captured vessel and through trial and error on the early hulls. The timber requirements were enormous. A single quinquereme required perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 cubic feet of timber. The keel and main structural members needed oak or other hardwood for strength. Planking could use softer woods, but still required substantial quantities. Oars needed to be shaped from single pieces of wood, 150 oars per ship. The mast and spars required tall, straight timber. For 120 ships, the total timber consumption exceeded 2 million cubic feet, requiring logging operations across much of Italy and transport of materials to construction sites. The metalwork requirements were equally challenging. Each ship needed bronze fittings for the ram, iron nails and spikes for joining structural members, bronze or iron hardware for the steering oars, metal reinforcements at stress points. The manufacture of these components required metalworking facilities and skilled craftsmen. The rams themselves, cast bronze structures weighing hundreds of pounds, required specialized foundry work to ensure they could withstand the shock of impact without breaking. The rope requirements were staggering. Each ship needed miles of rope for rigging, for securing various components, for operating the sail. Hemp rope was manufactured from plant fibers through a labor-intensive process. The scale of production required to supply 120 ships simultaneously demanded mobilization of rope-making capacity across the entire Roman alliance. While shipwrights labored on the hulls, the Roman Senate confronted an even more difficult problem: crews. Each quinquereme required 300 rowers plus sailors and marines. For 120 ships, Rome needed 36,000 trained rowers immediately. The Roman state had never recruited or trained naval crews before. They had no institutional structure for such recruitment, no training facilities, no experienced instructors. Carthaginian rowers trained for months or years before being considered combat-ready. Rome had weeks. The Roman solution was characteristically unconventional. Rather than attempting to train rowers at sea, which would require ships Rome didn't yet possess, Roman commanders ordered the construction of training rigs on land. These were wooden frames built to exactly match the rowing positions on a quinquereme. Benches were arranged at the proper heights and spacing. Oars were mounted on pivots to simulate the rowing motion. Crews were assigned to these land-based training rigs and drilled in the coordinated rowing movements while still on shore. The concept seemed absurd to anyone with naval experience. Rowing was fundamentally a maritime skill requiring feel for water resistance, adjustment to ship motion, coordination with waves and current. Training on dry land, without water, without the ship's movement, without any of the actual conditions of rowing, appeared useless. Carthaginian naval officers, hearing reports of Roman training methods, mocked the land-based rigs as evidence that Romans understood nothing about naval warfare. But the Roman system worked precisely because it focused on the specific problem Rome needed to solve. Roman commanders understood they couldn't turn farmers and soldiers into experienced seamen in 60 days. What they could do was teach the basic mechanical coordination required for mass rowing. The land-based rigs allowed drilling the simple, repetitive motion: extend the oar, pull back in unison, return to starting position. Crews practiced this motion thousands of times under the shouted timing of commanders, developing muscle memory and coordination. The training addressed Rome's actual constraint. Romans weren't going to outmaneuver Carthaginian ships through superior seamanship. They needed crews that could row their ships to contact with the enemy without the quinqueremes going in circles or having rowers smashing oars into each other. The land-based training provided exactly this basic competency. It was crude but functional, sufficient for Rome's tactical approach, which would rely on a different advantage than nautical skill. As ships neared completion and crews drilled on their training rigs, Roman commanders developed the tactical innovation that would offset Carthage's overwhelming advantage in naval experience. The innovation was a boarding bridge called the corvus, Latin for crow or raven. The device consisted of a 36-foot-long boarding plank mounted on a rotating pole on the ship's bow. The plank had a heavy iron spike underneath the far end. When deployed, the corvus would swing out over an enemy ship and drop. The spike would embed in the enemy deck, creating a secure boarding bridge. The corvus was revolutionary because it transformed naval combat from ramming duels requiring years of training into boarding actions where Roman infantry superiority would be decisive. Carthaginian quinqueremes carried marines, but naval combat traditionally minimized boarding because positioning two ships alongside each other while both maneuvered at speed was extremely difficult. Ships normally tried to ram enemies and escape before being boarded in return. The corvus changed the calculation entirely. Roman ships would sail directly at Carthaginian vessels, drop the corvus to lock the ships together, and send legionaries across to fight on the enemy deck. The tactical insight was that naval warfare didn't have to be naval warfare. If Romans could turn sea battles into land battles fought on wooden decks, their infantry superiority would determine outcomes regardless of Carthaginian advantages in seamanship. The corvus was the mechanism that enabled this transformation. It required no specialized knowledge to operate, just sail close to an enemy ship and drop the plank. The spike would embed and hold. Legionaries would cross and fight, using the same weapons and tactics that had made them dominant on land. The construction period was frantic but successful. Historians debate whether 60 days was literal or approximate, but Roman sources, particularly the historian Polybius, writing a century later with access to Roman records, indicate the fleet was constructed in approximately 2 months. By late summer 260 BC, Roman shipyards had produced over 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes. The vessels were crude by Carthaginian standards, built quickly by inexperienced workers following copied plans. But they were functional warships, adequately constructed, capable of carrying the forces Rome needed. The crews that manned these ships transferred from their land-based training rigs to the actual vessels. The transition was not seamless. Early attempts at coordinated rowing produced chaos as crews discovered that water resistance felt completely different from empty air, that the ship's motion required constant adjustment, that maintaining synchronization while the vessel pitched in waves was far harder than on stationary rigs. But the basic coordination had been internalized through repetitive land drilling. Crews learned to adjust to actual conditions more quickly than if they'd started from complete ignorance. The first major test came at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC. The Roman fleet, commanded by the consul Gaius Duilius, encountered a Carthaginian fleet of approximately 130 ships commanded by Hannibal Gisco, not Hannibal Barca, the famous general who would come later. The Carthaginians approached with confidence, bordering on contempt. They had professional naval crews, centuries of combat experience, and tactical doctrine that had defeated Greeks and Syracusans. The Romans had farmers and soldiers who had trained on wooden frames on land and had been in actual ships for perhaps weeks. The battle began with Carthaginian attempts to employ traditional ramming tactics. Carthaginian quinqueremes approached Roman vessels at speed, attempting to strike the hulls below the waterline with their bronze rams. But as Carthaginian ships closed with their targets, they encountered something unprecedented. Roman ships didn't attempt to evade or counter-ram. Instead, as Carthaginian vessels came within range, the Corvus boarding bridges swung out and dropped onto the Carthaginian decks, the heavy iron spikes embedded in the planking, locking the ships together. Before Carthaginian crews could react, Roman legionaries charged across the Corvus bridges. Each Roman ship carried 120 marines, effectively a full-strength Roman infantry century. These were soldiers who had trained for years in formation combat, who wore armor and carried shields and gladii, who fought with the discipline that made Roman infantry formidable on land. They poured across the bridges onto Carthaginian decks and attacked the enemy crews. Carthaginian sailors and marines were utterly unprepared for this type of combat. Naval battles didn't involve hundreds of heavily armed infantry boarding simultaneously. The Carthaginian crews, optimized for rowing and ramming tactics, found themselves in close-quarters infantry combat against opponents who trained specifically for such fighting. The outcome was one-sided slaughter. Roman legionaries methodically cleared Carthaginian decks, killing or throwing overboard enemy crews, capturing the vessels intact. Polybius, whose account provides the most detailed description of the battle, wrote that the Carthaginians were astounded by the construction of the Corvus and utterly at a loss what to do. Carthaginian commanders attempted to adjust, ordering ships to approach from angles where the Corvus couldn't reach, trying to ram Roman vessels before the bridges could deploy. But the Corvus could rotate to face threats from multiple directions, and even damaged Roman ships could drop their bridges onto attackers. The battle became a massacre of Carthaginian naval power. Roman sources claim 50 Carthaginian ships were captured or sunk, while Roman losses were minimal. Modern historians generally accept that Roman victory was decisive, though exact numbers may be exaggerated. The psychological impact was more significant than ship counts. Carthage's 5-century naval dominance had been shattered in a single afternoon by a fleet that had literally not existed 60 days before the battle. The strategic implications were immediate and profound. Rome's ability to create a navy from nothing and defeat the Mediterranean's dominant naval power in the fleet's first major engagement changed the entire strategic balance. Sicily could be contested because Rome could now transport and supply armies across the strait. Carthaginian naval superiority, the foundation of their strategic position, had evaporated. The war that Carthaginians expected to win through maritime blockade became a grinding contest on land where Roman military superiority would eventually prove decisive. The Corvus itself remained controversial. Roman allies praised it as brilliant innovation. Carthaginian sources called it a desperate trick, unworthy of proper naval warfare. The device was undeniably effective but had significant drawbacks. The Corvus was heavy, perhaps a ton of timber and iron mounted on the bow, and the weight affected ship stability and handling. Ships equipped with Corvus were slower and less maneuverable than standard quinqueremes. In rough weather, the top-heavy design made ships dangerous, prone to capsizing. The Romans lost several fleets to storms during the First Punic War, and the Corvus likely contributed to these disasters. Ships that would have survived rough weather without the added weight and wind resistance of the boarding bridge instead foundered. Eventually, probably by the 250s BC, Roman ships were built without Corvus as Roman crews gained actual naval experience and could fight using conventional tactics. But during the critical early years of the war, the Corvus gave Rome the ability to compete at sea, despite Carthaginian superiority in seamanship. The broader significance of Rome's fleet construction goes beyond the specific tactical innovation. Rome demonstrated an institutional capacity for rapid mobilization and adaptation that would characterize Roman military power for centuries. The willingness to attempt something unprecedented, to commit enormous resources to an uncertain venture, to innovate tactically when facing experienced opponents. These characteristics would appear repeatedly in Roman military history. The construction itself revealed Roman organizational capability. Building 120 ships in 60 days required coordinating timber procurement, metalworking, rope manufacture, and construction across dozens of sites. It required transporting materials, mobilizing thousands of workers, and maintaining quality control across geographically dispersed operations. The logistics were comparable to the construction programs that would later produce aqueducts, roads, and fortifications across the Roman Empire. The willingness to reverse engineer the Carthaginian quinquereme showed Roman pragmatism. There was no shame in copying an enemy design that worked. Roman military culture valued effectiveness over pride. If Carthaginian ships were proven successful, build copies rather than attempting to reinvent naval architecture from first principles. This practical approach to technology transfer would recur throughout Roman history as they adopted and adapted anything that improved military effectiveness. The Corvus innovation demonstrated tactical creativity in response to operational constraints. Roman commanders understood they couldn't match Carthaginian seamanship quickly. Rather than accepting defeat based on that limitation, they engineered a solution that negated the enemy's advantage. The Corvus wasn't elegant, it was a crude mechanical device that turned naval combat into infantry combat. But crude effectiveness beat elegant inadequacy. The device solved Rome's specific problem: how to win naval battles without trained naval crews. The training methodology, land-based drilling on wooden rigs, showed Roman ability to break complex problems into trainable components. Romans couldn't train complete sailors in weeks, but they could train the specific motor coordination required for mass rowing. The approach was reductionist and pragmatic, teaching only what was absolutely necessary, rather than attempting comprehensive instruction that time didn't permit. This focused training philosophy would appear in Roman military instruction across all domains. The First Punic War continued for another 21 years after Mylae, with numerous naval battles and several additional Roman fleet construction programs when storms destroyed ships. Rome eventually won the war in 241 BC, with a final naval victory at the Aegates Islands. The victory was achieved by a Roman fleet that, by that point, contained experienced sailors and commanders who had learned naval warfare through 2 decades of combat. The Romans of 241 BC had genuine naval expertise earned through hard experience, but that expertise would never have been developed if Rome hadn't created the initial fleet in 260 BC. The cost of Rome's naval wars with Carthage was staggering. Polybius estimated that over 700 Roman ships were lost during the First Punic War, mostly to storms. At 300-400 crew per ship, the human cost exceeded 200,000 dead, an almost incomprehensible casualty figure. The financial cost was equally ruinous, requiring special taxes and contributions from wealthy citizens to fund continued ship construction. Rome won the war, but was nearly bankrupted by the naval campaigns. Yet Rome persisted, despite these costs, because strategic calculation showed no alternative. Accepting Carthaginian naval supremacy meant conceding control of the Mediterranean and accepting permanent inferiority to a rival power. The Senate chose to pay any price and bear any burden to achieve naval parity with Carthage. This determination to outlast opponents, regardless of cost, would become characteristic of Roman strategic culture. The legacy of Rome's fleet construction in 260 BC extended far beyond the First Punic War. Rome became and remained a naval power, maintaining fleets in the Mediterranean for the next 600 years. The institutional knowledge built during the Punic Wars created a naval tradition where none had existed. By the time of Augustus Caesar in the 1st century BC, Roman fleets controlled the Mediterranean so completely that the sea was called Mare Nostrum, our sea. The tactical lesson about leveraging existing advantages rather than accepting enemy terms of combat influenced Roman military thinking broadly. When facing opponents with advantages Romans couldn't quickly match, Roman commanders would seek ways to fight battles on Roman terms. This pattern appeared against Macedonian phalanxes, against Parthian cavalry, against Germanic tribal warriors. Rome consistently adapted tactics to neutralize enemy strengths while exploiting Roman advantages. The engineering and organizational lessons applied to infrastructure projects throughout the empire. The same capacity for large-scale coordination that built 120 ships in 60 days would build roads, aqueducts, fortifications, and entire cities. Roman engineering achievements rested on organizational ability as much as technical knowledge. The capacity to mobilize resources, coordinate distributed operations, and maintain quality control enabled projects that other societies couldn't attempt. The story of how Rome built a fleet from nothing contains several distinct lessons about military power and institutional capability. First, that technological and tactical knowledge can be acquired rapidly when necessity demands it. Rome didn't have 5 centuries to develop naval tradition. They had weeks. They acquired the minimum necessary capability through reverse engineering, focused training, and tactical innovation. The approach wasn't pretty, but it worked. Second, that experiential advantages can be negated through tactical innovation. Carthage's centuries of naval experience should have been insurmountable. The Corvus negated that advantage by changing the nature of naval combat. When Romans couldn't win naval battles as traditionally fought, they changed what naval battles were. This willingness to redefine the terms of combat rather than accepting defeat within existing parameters was strategically decisive. Third, that determination and resource commitment can compensate for lack of experience and tradition. Rome suffered catastrophic fleet losses to storms but built replacement fleets. The financial and human costs were enormous, but Rome continued until victory was achieved. The institutional willingness to persist despite setbacks, to continue building fleets despite losing hundreds of ships, demonstrated strategic determination that outlasted Carthaginian resolve. Fourth, that copying proven solutions is often superior to attempting innovation from first principles when time is constrained. Rome's decision to reverse engineer Carthaginian ships rather than design original vessels saved perhaps years of iterative development. The willingness to adopt enemy technology without shame or pride proved more effective than attempting to develop indigenous solutions. The Carthaginian dismissal of Roman naval capability was entirely rational based on available information in 264 BC. Rome had no navy, no naval tradition, no maritime infrastructure, no trained crews. Every historical precedent said that naval powers weren't created quickly. Mediterranean maritime dominance belonged to peoples with centuries of seafaring tradition: Phoenicians, Greeks, Carthaginians. The idea that a land power could create a combat-effective fleet in weeks seemed absurd. But Carthaginian assumptions about what was possible missed the specific Roman characteristics that would make the impossible happen: the willingness to attempt unprecedented projects, the organizational capacity to coordinate complex operations across distributed sites, the tactical creativity to innovate when traditional approaches were unavailable, and the strategic determination to persist regardless of costs. These characteristics, rather than any specific technological advantage, explain how Rome built a fleet from scratch in 60 days. The mathematics weren't written in traditional shipbuilding knowledge or accumulated naval experience. They were written in reverse engineering methodologies that extracted usable knowledge from a single captured example, in training systems that focused ruthlessly on the minimum viable skills rather than comprehensive instruction, in tactical innovations that changed the rules of combat to favor existing strengths over enemy advantages, and in strategic determination that treated any cost as acceptable if it achieved the necessary outcome. The quinqueremes that slid into the water after 60 days of frantic construction were crude compared to Carthaginian vessels built by craftsmen with generational expertise. But crude functionality proved sufficient when combined with tactical innovation and determination. The Corvus boarding bridges that Carthaginian commanders mocked as ungainly, modifications proved devastatingly effective at turning naval battles into infantry combats where Roman soldiers excelled. The land-based training rigs that seemed absurd produced crews capable of rowing quinqueremes to battle, even if they couldn't execute complex naval maneuvers. Hanno the Great, watching from his quinquereme in 264 BC as Roman soldiers gathered across the Strait of Messina, was correct that Rome had no navy. What he couldn't foresee was that Rome would create one through methods that violated everything Mediterranean naval traditions said was necessary. The fleet that didn't exist in spring 260 BC won a decisive naval battle before summer ended, proving that when necessity demands it, institutional capability and determination can compress centuries of gradual development into weeks of focused effort. The Roman fleet, built from nothing in 60 days, didn't win through superior seamanship or traditional naval excellence. It won by changing what naval warfare was, by fighting on Roman terms rather than Carthaginian terms, by refusing to accept that lack of tradition meant accepting defeat. That refusal to accept limitation, combined with the capability to act on that refusal, would define Roman military power for the next 6 centuries.